Hey, hello all. In this session, we are going to see about service endpoint. Okay, so what is the use of service endpoint? Okay, let's take this diagram as a reference here. If you see here, there is this virtual machine in subnet 1, and there is Azure storage account. So by default, what happens, the communication between the virtual machine and the Azure storage will use these public IP address of VM to communicate. So in order to secure the Azure resources and make sure that the communication can happen through private IP address, we can use this service endpoint. So what happens when we introduce a service endpoint? We can create a service endpoint in the subnet level. So what we can do in this virtual network, we can add a service endpoint for this subnet, and what will happen? And then we will have to select the type of Azure resource for which we are going to configure this service endpoint for. So currently we have like options to create a service endpoint for multiple Azure resources like SQL, storage, Key Vault, Cosmos database. Likewise, a lot of Azure resources currently, they are supporting this service endpoint. Okay. So what we will be doing, we will be selecting this virtual network, and then we will be selecting this subnet, and then we will be creating the service endpoint. And then we will, in this, we will select for which Azure resource we are going to create this service endpoint for. That is what we will do as a first step. Second step, we'll have to go to this particular Azure resource, and then we'll have to add a firewall rule, and then we'll have to mention this VNet and the subnet in that firewall rule. By doing so, what will happen? Any external access via internet will be prohibited. But any other access that comes through the on-premises via express route or VPN gateway, or those will still have access, but based on the firewall rules, it is determined. Okay, so the public access is basically completely blocked by doing this. So again, just to the main idea is we will be having this virtual network and the subnet, and we will be creating a service endpoint for this virtual network for each subnet. Then what will happen? While creating this, we will mention for which resource we are going to create this service endpoint for. So in this case, I'm going to use a storage. So I'll mention in this service endpoint, the resource type is storage, Azure storage. Okay. Then the next step is I'll have to go to that particular storage, and in the storage, I'll have to add a firewall rule to mention what is the virtual network name and the subnet name. Please remember, only if you had configured this service endpoint in first place, you would find the option in this firewall to select that. Okay. Anyway, we can see that as part of our demo. Okay. Right. So the whole idea of service endpoint is to make sure that the Azure resource is able to communicate to the other resource, the same virtual network or the same region, using a private IP address instead of public IP address. Okay. Now let's go into the demo. I just want to show you the steps that we will be following as part of this demo. So yeah, it's going to be a very simple demo only. So first we'll be creating a virtual network, and in this virtual network, which I'll be naming as VNet1, I'll be creating two subnets, subnet 1 and subnet 2. So I'm not going to create any virtual machines and all. Let's imagine like whatever resources you're going to add as part of the subnet 1 and subnet 2, based on the service endpoint we are going to create, they will have the respective access. Okay. For now, just follow the steps. We'll be creating a virtual network, then subnet 1 and subnet 2 will create. Then I'll be creating a storage account. So now what I will do, I will add a service endpoint in this virtual network VNet 1 only for subnet 1. I'm not going to add this for subnet 2. Then only I'll be able to show you the difference. Okay, because after adding the service endpoint in VNet 1 for subnet 1, I'll go to the storage account, and in the firewall rules, I will select this VNet 1 subnet 1. Okay, so by I'll be able to select only VNet 1, subnet 1 in the storage account. I'll show you what happens when I try to select VNet 1, subnet 2. It won't allow to select. It will say that the service endpoint isn't configured. So that's the main difference here. The first step is you'll have to configure the service endpoint from the virtual network level and the corresponding subnet level, and then you'll have to go to the while configuring the service endpoint, you'll have to mention the type of Azure resource for which we are going to configure this, where I will select Azure storage. Okay, then I will go to that particular storage, and then I'll select this virtual network on the subnet. Okay, so that's how you'll be linking this virtual network subnet to the respective Azure resource. Okay, let's go to the portal. You'll get more idea about this. Okay, so already we have a resource group. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just create quickly a virtual network with two subnets in it. Okay, so creating virtual network. Okay, so region I'm fine with West US3. Okay, I'm going to select the default subnet. I'm going to give my own address space here. Okay, I'm going to add a subnet. Okay, sorry. Okay, this I'm going to name as subnet 1. The IP address I'm going to give it here. Okay, add, and I'm going to add subnet 2. Okay, this I'm going to use maybe 10.8.1.0/24 and add this also. Okay, so rest all I'm just going to go with the defaults. Okay, validation passed, create. Okay, I also want to create a storage account now, because only then I'd be able to show you the demo how I can create a service endpoint and link that in the storage account, isn't it? So I'm going to create a storage account. So this deployment is in progress. Meanwhile, let me open another tab so that I can create my storage account. Okay. Okay, so I have opened another tab. So I'm going to create a storage account. So I'm going to search here for storage account. So I can see it here. I'm selecting this, create storage account. Okay, so resource group, I'm selecting the respective resource group. Storage account name, this should be unique throughout all the other subscriptions. So I'm going to try to give a unique name. So let me give it as like this, storage 157. It's already taken. Three. Let's try this. Okay, I think it's fine. Okay, I'm going to stick to same region, West US3. Okay, standard is fine. So redundancy, I'm going to choose. Okay, just for this demo, I want to show you. So I'll choose this GZRS, GeoZone Redundant Storage. Okay, fine. Next, advanced. So I'm fine with all these default options. So next, networking. So by default, it says enable public access from all networks. So I'm going to go with this default option. The rest all I'm okay with that. Tags, review, create. It's running the final validation. Okay, let me see if, okay, so it says it failed. Click here to view details. Okay, it's already taken. Okay, fine. No worries. Let's try to give a very unique name. Okay, so I'm going to create it again. Okay, so now it is fine. Validation passed. I'm creating it. So let the storage account get deployed. I'm going to see if the virtual network has got created. Yes, it has got created. I'm going to this resource. So let that storage account, be getting deployed in the backend. Now, the next step is I'm going to add a service endpoint to this virtual network. Okay. So what I have to do right now, if you see, I'm in my virtual network. Okay. I'll just show you again. So I'm going to my resource group and I'm going to my virtual network. Okay. So in the virtual network, if you see, there are a lot of options. If you just come below, there is this option called service endpoints. I need to click the service endpoints. So as of now, there is no service endpoints. I'm going to add a new service endpoint. So if you remember, in this virtual network, you have two subnets. I'm going to just add one service endpoint only for one subnet. Okay. So I'm going to select this. Okay. Now in the service, I need to choose for which service I want to create the service endpoint for. Let's say you are having a SQL database. You can create this service endpoint for the SQL database also. In that case, you'll have to select Microsoft SQL. But in this case, I know I want to create this service endpoint for storage account, isn't it? So I'm selecting Microsoft.storage. Okay. So, okay, fine. As of now, let's not worry about these policies. So then it asks for subnet. You see here, there is an option that I can select both my subnets. So in this case, what will happen? Whatever the resources that gets created in these two subnets, those resources will be communicating with my storage devices using the private IP addresses. Okay. But in this case, just to show the difference, I'm going to select only subnet 1. Okay. So I'm going to create this service endpoint in VNet 1 just for this subnet 1. I'm going to give add. Okay, so this will take just few seconds. Meanwhile, let me check if storage account has got deployed. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so storage account deployment has completed. Okay, right. So let's wait for this. Okay, now if you see here, again, I have come back to the VNet. The VNet, a new service endpoint has got created. Okay, so one thing you could see here, only for this storage account, this is applicable. See what happens in Azure, right? Microsoft has created something called region pair. So what is region pair? Region pair is nothing but for each region, Microsoft has created a corresponding region pair because that is the region where the corresponding backup will be automatically configured. Even this is applicable for databases also. Like for example, in database there is a concept called failover groups. So even in the failover groups, what we normally do, let's say if we have a database created in East US, okay, and when you go for the failover groups, we will create a secondary database in its in its corresponding region pair. So Microsoft already have identified which region has its region pairs like that. So they have basically given the list of region pairs. So for East US, its region pair is West US. So that's what it is happening here. So even though we created storage in West US 3, if you see automatically it has configured it along with its region pair, which is East US. Okay. Yeah. So this is only applicable for the storage account. Okay. So yeah. Now what I'm going to do now, so we have configured the service endpoint. Now I'll be going into this actual Azure resource, that is the storage account, and I will try to show you how that service endpoint will be, applicable or available there. Right. To do this, I'm here. So now what I have to do, I have to just scroll down. You just scroll down, you will find something. You will find something called firewall rules. Let's see where it is. It should be networking, I believe. Yeah, so I'm coming to networking. Okay, so in the networking, you can see firewall and virtual networks. As of now, the default option, it says enabled from all networks, but we want to go with from selected virtual networks and IP addresses. So what I'm doing here, I'm changing the option to enabled from selected virtual networks and IP addresses. So remember, this is the option we should choose when we want to configure the service endpoint here. Okay, so we have to first create the service endpoint, and we'll have to link the service endpoint here in the respective Azure resource. That's what we are doing it here. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to click on add existing virtual network. If I do that, I'll be finding my virtual network. Okay, yeah, fine. Then I'll have to select my subnet also. If you see here, there are like two subnets. Yeah, subnet 1. If you remember, this is the subnet for which we configured the service endpoint. And if you see in the subnet 2, since we didn't configure the service endpoint, Azure automatically points to you that service endpoint is required. If I try to configure this, it won't work. So it says the following networks don't have service endpoints enabled for Microsoft storage. So it cannot be done basically. Okay, so it is very pretty evident, right? So first thing is you'll have to configure your service endpoint for a subnet in a virtual network, and then you'll have to basically link that subnet by going to these firewalls and virtual networks within this networking option of the particular resource. In this case, the example we are considering is a storage account. Yeah. So by default, this option will be like enabled from all networks. But when you want to enable a service endpoint connectivity to use private IP address, you'll have to select this option, enabled from selected virtual networks and IP addresses. And then you'll have to select the virtual network and the respective subnet and add. Okay. So now what has happened? So this virtual network and the respective subnet has been added here inside this storage account. Okay. So now what will happen before this or before the service endpoint creation, the communication between the virtual machine, between the subnet, it can be any resources within the subnet 1, and this storage account would have used the public IP address. But after doing this, what will happen? The communication will happen between any resources that will get created in the subnet 1 to the storage account via private IP address. Okay, so that's the use of service endpoints. Okay, yeah. Okay, guys, that's what I wanted to explain you. So if you see here, I think we have got all the steps here. We first created a virtual network, then subnet 1, subnet 2, then we created storage account, then we added a service endpoint in the subnet 1 of VNet 1, then we went to the storage account and the firewall rules. We selected the VNet 1, subnet 1. So after doing this step, the traffic will be using this private IP address of any resource in subnet 1 that wants to communicate to storage account. Okay. Thank you, guys.